First of all, I'd like to thank Betsy for the invitation to be here. The Iowa Greenhouse Gas Inventory is really my baby, and anytime anybody wants to hear about your kids, you talk about them. So with that, so the DNR does an annual greenhouse gas inventory. It has been required by Iowa Code since 2007. In that year, Senator Rob Hogue and Senator Joe Bolcom, who you might know of, passed a bill, or got a bill through, that requires the DNR to do this annual greenhouse gas inventory. It also created the Iowa Climate Change Advisory Council, which has now been disbanded. And it also requires the DNR, anybody that applies for an air construction permit from the DNR, so if you're an industrial facility that wants to start up, you now have to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions and what you believe they will be before you can get a permit from us. So the inventory includes Iowa emissions from several source categories, and when possible, we try to use Iowa-specific data. So for instance, our agriculture emissions are calculated with actual bushels of corn grown, number of pigs, number of cows, things like that. We use the data from landfills that our Solid Waste Bureau collects, and we also use monitor data from power plants. There are some categories like, say, ozone depleting substances, where we don't have data for Iowa. So what we do is we take the total national emissions from that category and we ratio it down for our population. So we assume that our emissions would be 1.1% of whatever the national emissions are. So why do we do this? Well, it's a good way to evaluate trends in emissions. We have a baseline, so when action is taken or policies are created to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have a baseline now from 2007 that we can track progress. And basically, this is what my boss tells me all the time. You can't manage what you don't measure. So if you want to manage greenhouse gas emissions, you need to count them. And I should point out, there were 3 earlier inventories done. There was one done in 1990, 2000, one by UNI, one by the University of Iowa, and there was also one done in 2005 for the Climate Change Advisory Council, and that was done by a consultant. So what sources of greenhouse gas emissions are there in Iowa? Our inventory is limited to 6 greenhouse gases, and by far the biggest one is carbon dioxide. And the biggest source of that is power plants and combustion of fossil fuels by factories and people in Iowa. Power plants do emit methane and nitrous oxides, but it's on a very small scale compared to the carbon dioxide. It's also emitted by cars. And then methane is emitted by animals in Iowa, and that's emitted in 2 ways. One is animal manure, and the other is cows and sheep and goats have ruminant stomachs. So as they digest their food, they emit methane. Nitrous oxides in Iowa are emitted from Iowa soils. When you apply nitrogen fertilizer to soil or to golf courses or to your lawn. And we also have 2 facilities that manufacture nitrous oxide. And then this down in the corner, the HFCs, PFCs, and SF6. HFCs and PFCs are usually chemicals that are now used because we moved away from chlorofluorocarbons because of the hole in the ozone. So we started using these, like in refrigeration, and they emit their greenhouse gases. And then SF6, sulfur fluorohexide, is found in power lines, and also if you buy like a little can of air from Best Buy to clean out your computer keyboard, that's SF6. And earlier you heard a little bit about forcing. So everything I talk about in this presentation is going to be in units of carbon dioxide equivalents. And basically what that is methane traps 23 times more heat than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide traps 310 times more heat than carbon dioxide. Sulfur hexafluoride traps 23,000 times more heat than carbon dioxide. So what we do is we ratio those together so they're same scale, and that's called carbon dioxide equivalence. So in Iowa last year, there were 133.56 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents emitted, and this is kind of how it breaks down. So if you take the fossil fuel combustion by residents, factories, power plants, and you add it with agriculture, that amounts to over 2/3 of all the greenhouse gases in Iowa. The industrial processes over here in the corner, that's really emissions from just a handful of facilities. So we have 3 facilities that manufacture ammonia. We have 2 that manufacture nitric acid. We have a lime plant, 2 cement production facilities, and 3 iron and steel facilities. And their actual manufacturing process emits greenhouse gases in addition to the fossil fuels that they use. Land use change in forestry, that would include carbon that's sequestered in forests or carbon that's emitted when forests are cut down, as well as when you apply urea or other things to soil. And it's very small. And the waste includes emissions from landfills as well as wastewater treatment. So this is why the Iowa inventory is kind of interesting. So over on the right, we have the breakdown of emissions in the United States. So in the United States, agriculture is a very small portion of greenhouse gas emissions, and energy is a very large portion. In Iowa, agriculture is huge, and energy is a little bit less. So the rest of my talk is going to kind of focus on energy and agriculture, not to pick on them, but just because they're kind of how they differ for the rest of the country. So these are the United States greenhouse gas emissions from 2005. EPA publishes an annual report. They're going down. They've reduced 10% since 2005. And that is basically because Americans are using less fossil fuels. Plants that produce electricity are switching from coal to natural gas, mostly because of the price of natural gas. And then also the vehicle standards that have been passed to reduce emissions from cars. And when energy is 84% of your emissions, and you have these reductions in fossil fuel use, it goes down. So these are Iowa greenhouse gas emissions since 2005. They've kind of seesawed, but they're going up. They fell 3% last year, but we're still 8% above the 2005 levels. And this kind of seesawing is really interesting because, let's see, this period from 2005 to 2007 where it goes up. There's several factors there. 2007 was one of the largest corn and soybean crops ever. It had the most fertilizer applied to fields during that time period. We had 39 ethanol plants come online during that period, and they burned fossil fuels to dry the corn before they make the ethanol. We also had, in 2007, a 900 megawatt power plant unit come online. In this slope in the middle, you kind of look at that and you think, okay, that's when the recession was. People use less electricity, companies produce less things. Part of that is also kind of caused by climate change. So in that time period, you had the flood of 2008. Power plant in Cedar Rapids went offline. Power plant in Iowa City went offline. Many of the big manufacturers, ADM, Quaker Oats, weren't producing anything during that time period. And then after the recession, after the flood, things kind of bounced back. And then last year, we had a very large decrease in power plant emissions because some of the power plant regulations, they're moving to renewables. We also had a drought, so agriculture production was down. So emissions really depend on the weather. They depend on crop prices, the number of animals we're growing, things like that. And that's what I like you to kind of remember about this seesaw. So this decrease in the last year was the equivalent to 4.5 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. So what's that mean? So that amount of greenhouse gases would be equivalent to the emissions from 10.5 million barrels of oil. If you planted 116 million tree seedlings and let them grow for 10 years, they would sequester that much carbon. This EPA greenhouse gas equivalency calculator is a really good tool. You can type in amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and it will tell you what it's equivalent to. So the first thing that was interesting that I mentioned was the energy emissions. So in Iowa, over half of the emissions from energy are from the actual generation of electricity by power plants. So they burn coal, they burn natural gas, whatever, to produce electricity. Industrial sources is that lighter green. They burn fossil fuels in their manufacturing processes. And then homes and businesses combust a smaller amount of fuel. And over on the right, you can see that the emissions from the power plants have decreased pretty significantly in the past 2 years. Industrial emissions have kind of gone up, and residential and commercial are going down, but they're such a small percentage that it's kind of hard to see their impact. And I also included this to kind of show the scale of how much power plant emissions are. We have made a lot of progress in emissions from energy. In 2005, 78% of our electricity was generated from coal in Iowa. Now it's 63%, and actually I think in 2013 it's more like 61. The wind generation has increased to 27%. Mid-American has another huge wind turbine project going in, and EPA has future regulations coming up to reduce carbon emissions from power plants. So in the future, I would expect emissions from electric generation to go down. Sources of emissions from agriculture. There's a lot of different sources of emissions. I kind of mentioned this before. So you have animals digesting their food and releasing the gas. You have manure. We have a lot of that in Iowa. And then soils, which also includes animals on pasture that put waste directly on the pasture. Agriculture and burning in Iowa is very, very small. There's absolutely no reason to burn a cornfield. In other states, emissions from agriculture burning, like Louisiana, where they burn sugarcane, are much, much higher. And this kind of just breaks down how much that is. So the animals and their manure are about 44%. Soils are about 56%. And the emissions from soils come from applying fertilizer, and when that runs off. And also, most of it is from the nitrogen cycle that takes place in soil, and so that emits N2O. And I should point out that there is carbon that's stored in soil. When you till a field that's disturbed, the carbon can be released. Our inventory doesn't include carbon sequestration in soil because it's a very complicated process. There's a lot of studies about it that aren't in agreement in how much carbon is sequestered or how much carbon is emitted when you till. And frankly, that's kind of more of a university level research thing, and we don't have the staff or the expertise to include that. We do note that in the inventory. And I also thought you might be interested in large sources of greenhouse gases in the United States are required to report their greenhouse gas emissions annually to the EPA. And the EPA has a public website that you can go to, and you can see the emissions from the factories, power plants in Iowa, anything in the United States, landfills. And you can also make your own pie charts, run reports from this. And I've included the website at the bottom, but basically you can go in here and zero down to the facility level. And they have data since 2010. We use the data that's reported from power plants and factories in our inventory, and that actually is probably the most certain part of our inventory, because power plants in Iowa have continuous emission monitors, so they're continuously monitoring the amount of CO2 emitted. That was started with the acid rain program in the 90s. So we have a really good feel for the power plant emissions, and then these other sources of emissions. So thank you very much for coming. This is our website. If you go on that website, we have all of the greenhouse gas emissions ever done, inventories ever done for Iowa. And we also have information on air pollution regulations in Iowa that apply to climate change. And you can also get to the Iowa Climate Change Advisory Board's work through that site. And then I've included EPA for you. That's a really good site for just general climate change knowledge. Thank you.